everyone for joining today. I see a list of attendees over here and people chatting. This is a nice interface, so I'll definitely take time for some questions after my lecture. I hope to not overburden you with too many slides. I am going to go through certain sections rather fast because I believe wow, 230 slides. So if a picture is worth 1,000 words, you're going to get 230,000 words from me right now. So I'll try to keep it at a good pace. But in today's lecture, basically what I'm touching on is not only the full derivative of things that I've learned up to this point, but also some of the newest research that I'm looking into around the Ark of the Covenant and how its possible origins around holding the 10 Commandments and the story being connected to the Exodus from Egypt might have some precursor stories that are extremely interesting involving the Great Pyramid of Giza. So I'm going to go ahead and just make my way through this, and please feel free to comment here if these don't work or if I'm doing something wrong. But hopefully everyone sees Gods of the Bible here. And let's see, I should be able to just go full screen. I'm not going to do that so I can see your comments. Okay. All right. So basically, as I started looking into some research around the Ark of the Covenant, some of the traditional biblical understandings of its usage and descriptions, I started to do research into various Renaissance age biblical artwork and finding actual physical Bibles that obtained that have imagery that we've been able to obtain that show either scenes of the Ark being used or referencing the Ark or demonstrating the same type of power that is usually seen with the Ark. So what you'll see here is a collection of images that are most widely known in Renaissance artwork as biblical scenes, but you can kind of see a theme that's happening here, which is things are always taking place in the sky, that there's events and beings and sometimes the conveyance of craft with wings and such, where things are happening in the sky. And that there was actually beings, of course, that came down from the sky. And so a lot of these stories in their traditional sense are very interesting. I, being raised as a Christian, always thought, wow, this is kind of interesting that there's something beyond Earth, but not enough to very substantiate it. It was always kind of like heaven is just kind of up there. So where it kind of gets interesting is that you can see that there's this overall theme where not only are they seeing things in the sky in the conveyance of craft or actual human-like beings, but now they're being given knowledge from these beings. And scene after scene, this is being represented in many different cultures, biblical texts, as far as documenting the evidence for these interactions. So while a lot of this artwork might be symbolic in nature, and this artist, of course, was, she was very well known, there's a lot of symbology in a lot of this artwork, but I think it also speaks to a larger perspective. Now that we look into the past and try and make connections around the ancient astronaut theory, it's very clear that we can see representations of, again, a conveyance of flight, some knowledge that these people are actually either coming out of some type of a craft or have opened a doorway. But any of these large biblical figures are actually being surrounded with technology. So time after time, a lot of these things that we see have to do with their ability and how that medium exists that they communicated to the human beings. And so the human beings in their representation of the technology seem to be giving us hints of technology, meaning it's not magic. They were doing their best to represent what they saw, but our interpretation of it is not magic. It's technology. So again, a lot of these things, this is a famous scene of, Christ on the cross. This is actually, I believe, a fresco on a church wall in Yugoslavia. And it was painted, I believe, in the 16th century. The point of that is it's really, really high up on the ceiling and it's hard to see. And if you get up there on a ladder, you'll look on the corners here, on the left and right corners of the image, and you see, again, a conveyance of a craft and a being actually piloting the craft. So over and over these scenes of the power of flight, throughout our history, I think is a question that speaks to where people of our type, human beings, flying around in the skies and earth in ancient times, possibly but it appears that what we're seeing is an overriding pattern of them being able to replicate what they were seeing without maybe not even fully understanding the components of how it worked. So a lot of these conveyances of flight are enough of an impact to say, wow, it looks like, I guess, some kind of a craft. But they get very specific in nature. And so as we started to look into some of these more specific cultures, I was always very fascinated with the Sumerian culture, because all of the references in the Bible of Adam and Eve or the Garden of Eden, the idea that there were winged beings that they reference as angels, all of these references and many more are found in Sumerian epics that are at least 2,000 to 4,000 years earlier than the King James and the Old Testament Hebrew version. Probably the recorded original versions of some of these tales, like the Great Flood. So a lot of this information really started to resonate with me around their descriptions of these gods that came to visit the Sumerians, which they called the Anunnaki. Now, many of the artifacts that were pulled out of ancient Iraq, which was then called Sumer, Mesopotamia, Babylon, but specifically Sumer, they had a very ingenious system of conveying information. Not only did they have a written language called Sumerian cuneiform script, someone called a stylist would use an oversized screwdriver and could turn it and twist it into wet clay and make a document, a text document, and then they'd fire that into a kiln, a stove, literally keying that phrase writing in stone. But accompanying their text, they had what we see here is the imprint of a cylinder seal. So they would take, also in the same clay that they write in, these round precious stones and could leave a positive impression. Let me go back. I have a few more of these we'll see, but it's a very interesting way to disseminate knowledge. So they had these perfectly carved reverse images that they would press over the clay to leave a positive surface and disseminate the pictures and the text throughout the city, like an old school newspaper, but very efficient. And you can see that, again, this depiction of the winged disc really is kind of prevalent in all of their artwork, and a lot of their pressings, cylinder seals, wall reliefs. It's kind of an overriding theme. And as we kind of jump, and forgive me, as I said, I'm going to jump around a little bit, folks. Now, this specific section we're looking at, I'm just kind of showing many instances that throughout the past, all these conveyances of flight, they did a pretty accurate job based on the knowledge they had. Now, this artist did a very excellent job. Again, this is the Madonna. I believe the artist is Saint Giovanni. And you can see that here, when we look at the picture, it's actually a cut-off version, but she's holding the baby Jesus down here. But as we zoom in, you can see that there's a gentleman over to the, let's see, maybe right side of your screen, is a gentleman holding his hands up, shielding his eyes, and there's a dog actually there as well. And they're both looking up at an object that appears to be emanating rays of energy of some kind. And this is very typical with all of the ufology sightings that we have today, is even with a camcorder, when we record it, it's basically just a ball of light, no matter how close we can zoom in. The reason why is because we're looking at a large energy discharge from a craft that is in a gaseous atmosphere. The byproduct of that is going to be photons, light. So the artist did a fairly accurate representation of showing, which even today is some type of UFO sighting. Now, again, this significance, going back to the Sumerian culture as another example for the power of flight, this is one of their gods, Inanna, also known as Ishtar, and she used to roam the skies of Earth. A funny story from King Gilgamesh in one of his epic of creation tales. He commented that one time Ishtar invited him up to her sky abode, and he said, no thank you, because all of the previous men that you've invited to your sky abode never returned. So she used to like to roam the skies of Earth, a very interesting artifact that shows, again, extreme detail in being able to see them create the conveyance of flight, or at least her representation of having the power of flight. Now, again, we've even seen this to cross into other cultures like Egypt, sun god Ra and Isis and other symbols, Osiris and various other references that use the winged disc for a symbol of higher status. or many other references, in fact, but I like to tie it to basically that overriding knowledge of the power of flight. Now, some of the artifacts that they found in Egypt, one of these was found in an Egyptian governor's tomb. It was on display for many years as a bird model until a gentleman who was doing research looking at various other artifacts and cultures across cultures and how they had representations for the power of flight. This one actually is a plane. It's a representation of a plane. It has more characters intrinsic to a plane than that of a bird. The angle of the fin, the angle of the wing. So it's very interesting that we see a lot of these artifacts being shed into a new light. These coming out of Central America, again, with the same type of connection in Egypt, they were put on display as insect models. And again, you can see that these are very detailed and characteristic, made of solid gold. But under closer observation, they have what's more intrinsic to the characteristics of a modern day plane. The angle of the wing, the 90-degree tail fin. So seems very evident that, again, the ancient astronaut theory could be playing out here. And a simple example of that would be, we have another term for the ancient astronaut theory and more of a legitimized mainstream science view, which would be the cargo cult syndrome, which is, and it could be applied to, seeing extraterrestrials. Cargo cult syndrome simply is that World War I, World War II, Aboriginal tribes, all of a sudden American pilots show up in prop planes and land their prop plane and get out of the plane, light up a cigarette. Aboriginal comes up to him with a spear and he's like, "Who are you?" And he holds out a voice recorder and records the Aboriginal's voice while he's smoking a cigarette and plays it back to him. The Aboriginal can't believe that he's like caught the guy's spirit somehow, and he hears his own voice. He sees the plane, he thinks it's a living object. He doesn't understand that it's a machine. So a funny thing starts to happen. The soldiers set up camp and they start to receive drop shipments from planes. They're there for 2-3 months at a time, let's say. So they receive these shipments on a regular basis. So these large planes fly over, huge parachute opens up, and a big thing of cargo opens up. It was dropped. Now, sometimes these shipments wouldn't land in the soldiers' camp. They drift and land in one of the tribes or near one of the camps, of the tribe. So the tribe would crack it open, and it's full of knives and guns and food. And so they literally thought these were like shipments from the gods, or supreme other beings. They didn't understand. Soldiers eventually pack up their stuff and leave, and an interesting phenomenon happens. They create perfect replica models out of straw, and twigs, and branches of these prop planes, scrape away runways, clearing the runways that the soldiers initially made for the planes to land, and sit there for hours, looking at the skies, hoping to lure back these amazing gifts that they were receiving from the skies. So, this is the same scenario that we can see played out in other epochs of time, where the ancient astronaut theory has been played out many times, where just like this artifact you see here, they were very good at recording what they were seeing without maybe not fully understanding its true function. This one is a very interesting artifact in display, I believe, in a Turkish museum. It was actually put on display by Zachariah Sitchin, bugging the curator of the museum to say, "Look, I know you don't agree with me that it's a rocket ship, but why don't you let your visitors, decide?" And so he actually got them to put it on display for a limited time, like an exhibit, as the headless rocket ship with like a question mark, But if you look at the characteristics of this, it's very similar to our retired space shuttle. Speaking on that, I hope all of you just might have got to see the SpaceX landing. I'm here in California, so about 20 miles, no, not even 20 miles, 10 miles north of me here at Newport to Huntington, and about 200 miles out, they did a landing on an inflatable cargo of the SpaceX rocket just about 30 minutes ago, I believe, something like that. And that was a successful landing. So very interesting. Again, the descriptions that ancient man was able to replicate in some of their artifacts, I think, are very significant in how much they were able to convey with accuracy what they were seeing. Clearly, this looks like some type of a rocket ship. You can see the gentleman's knees are even bent at the knee there, and he's just unfortunately missing his head. But then we see thrusters in the back that, very reminiscent of a modern rocket ship. Okay, now some of the artifacts that we have on display is a very interesting set around the world that show a conveyance of an understanding of technology. This is the Antikythera mechanism. It's found off the coast of Antikythera near Greece. And when under microscopic, or excuse me, under radar, they were able to see that this contains somewhere between 35 to 70 interweaving cogs and wheels. It's a very intricate machine that was encased in a box at one point, and they felt that it served two functions. Function number one was that it was used as an astrological device. So someone could essentially tune the device, excuse me, to your birth date and say, oh, well, the planets are going to align at these certain times, and you'll be best suited to carry out certain things at certain times. The other purpose was an astronomical device, which would allow the user to navigate, perhaps tuning it to a certain star or something of that magnitude, and being able to navigate knowing the movements of the heavens based on this calibrated box. So very interesting piece of technology that has been found recently. Not recently, but it was early 1900s. Now, this one's still open for debate, and I wish I could reach back over my shoulder here and pick it up for you, but I am mic'd, and that's probably not safe. But what we have in Egypt, in a certain area there, is a crypt called Dendera, and it's literally known as the light-giving source. There's two pieces of information in Dendera that are given to us. One is a wall relief on the wall that shows a map of the heavens 8,000 years, well, 6,000 years before the traditional culture. Essentially, it's around 8,000 years old of when the sky and the positions and what positions the stars were in around 8,000 years ago. Now, that's pretty heavy considering that the Egyptian culture is supposed to be around 2500 BC. This goes well beyond their time frame, that they're charting the stars of how they would have looked in the heavens well into their past, or maybe they were around much further than we currently understand. We'll come back to that. The second part of Dendera, this area known as the light-giving source, has a lot of these wall reliefs like you see here, which some people to interpret is an actual lamp, some conveyance of light. Excuse me. There's some conveyance of light, and modern archaeologists say that, well, they're holding up the lotus flower, symbolic reference of the lotus flower, and that bloom, that flume of filament that you see with a little snake in the middle is just the aroma of the lotus flower. Okay, that's fine. But if you look closely at this image, you can see that not only does it look like a light bulb, but it appears to be even plugged into some type of a device. Every one of these images, you can see that it's actually plugged into some type of a jedge pillar or something that would look like a modern day transistor or some type of harness of energy. Now, what's really interesting about the Dendera bulb is that all over Egypt, in these crypts and tombs, there's rarely ever any evidence of soot, of flame being carried through the tombs. There's no evidence of a lot of soot on the ceiling. So how are they able to carve these intricate wall reliefs, hieroglyphics, and stone carvings without the use of light? Now, modern Egyptologists say that it was either flame or that they used copper mirrors to reflect the light into the, to the passages to get where they needed. So another idea is very simple. Exactly what they see is that they had low-level electricity and were able to generate the light. Now, what's interesting about this topic is I actually had a bulb made on the Dendera spec and filled it with a low plasma energy, basically like you've heard a misidentified swamp gas sighting, a UFO sighting. It was ignited swamp gas. Well, the Egyptians would have had the same access to methane gas naturally emitted from the ground, from a swamp or what have you, probably near the Nile, all over the place, that would allow them to capture that, and with a low energy discharge, just a low amount of electricity could easily generate phosphorescence. And if you look over my left shoulder, I actually have the bulb you see on camera right back there on the shelf. And right above it, as we'll come to in a moment, is the power source, which is a Baghdad battery. Now, A modern day flashlight takes 9 volts, let's say. You can power one of these with around 4 volts. And you can easily get enough light to fill it in a dark room to see what you're doing on a wall. Now, the Baghdad battery is a very interesting component to this because it's found in the same time frame of around 2500 BC. And it's very interesting. They found about a dozen of these so far. And essentially, it's just a clay pot with a copper filling and an iron rod, and they usually use an asphalt, like a rubbery stopper, to kind of seal it. And if you stick any weak acidic acid, wine, vinegar, grape juice, you actually generate positive electrons. So I actually have a couple of those back here on my shelf as replicas, and I'm sorry the image is so small. Maybe you can zoom in on my camera. But these on camera, I was able to generate 4 volts with one that's about just over 6 inches tall. And I easily got a current of 4 volts. Now, there's mine on the shelf, an enlarged image. Now, what's interesting about these is that 4 volts from around 6 inches, some of the vials we see in Egypt are around 6 to 9 feet tall. And the only explanation they can say for the Baghdad battery was that they were using it to change to change the way you could like spray jewelry with, a fine gold or something, and heat it up and change its properties. But another analogy also accepted was, which is kind of funny, is, they had competing churches. And so one of the ideas is that they would be able to create a static charge buildup in some of these statues. And so as you would enter the church, you would actually see or feel a buzz coming from the statue, and when you went up to touch it, it would give you like a static discharge. This is like, oh, the power of the gods, a little trick by the priest. But the other theory is that these were able to actually harness much more voltage, more like if I got 4 volts out of a 6-inch one, a 7-foot, maybe you can get 60, 70 volts. Now you're talking about some significant wattage. So it's a very interesting hypothesis to understand that there's a lot of lower level technology, especially when I look at the comments here, electricity is old tech. Yes, it is. So let's just not put the bar there. Let's not just say the Egyptians were, wow, they had light bulbs. Good for them. No, it doesn't stop there. It turns out that there's some crossovers with some of the knowledge that we have coming out of Egypt, and some of these stories that we have around certain pharaohs and their exodus of Egypt, certain key figures and their exodus of Egypt, and some crossovers of the story. Now, I'm still working on some of the pieces to lay out the differences between Akhenaten and Moses, or were they actually the same person? But it turns out there's quite a bit of evidence to show that Akhenaten, who was one of the first pharaohs of Egypt, that upheld a different set of rules around his dynasty and didn't believe in many different gods. He believed in one god, the Aten, the sun, the Aten, A-T-E-N. And what's really interesting about Akhenaten is that he seems to have been not only access to a different set of principles, but also probably a different realm and handed down ideas of technology. So a lot of the crossovers that we have with Akhenaten and Moses seem to reflect around the time frame as to when they both had their exodus and they both took their people with them. The interesting crossover is there seems to be a discrepancy behind what the true purpose was of the exodus. Now, in Moses' story, we have him leaving with the Israelites and taking them to the base of the mountain, where at some point Moses goes up, gets the 10 Commandments, comes down, and now we have the Ark of the Covenant appear in the story. 10 Commandments are put in there, story continues. Now, it turns out in the other legend, very similar to Moses' story, is Akhenaten, who also left Egypt, but possibly took a large golden box supported by 2 poles on each side with him. This golden box also seems to have the exact same dimensions for the grand sarcophagus in the Great Pyramid of Giza. So there seems to be a connection between the Ark of the Covenant and how it has the exact same dimensions to fit right into what we would call the Great Sarcophagus in the Pyramid of Giza. But maybe it's not a sarcophagus. Maybe this is a large energy plant, and the Ark of the Covenant is the battery. Now, if Akhenaten left with the large battery of Egypt, of course the reigning pharaoh, who might have been Ramses I, Ramses II, depending on the time frames, would of course want to come after him and say, give me back my battery. Because not only are we talking about a power, but we're talking about something that could have been a power and technology well beyond our current understanding. But we do know that around the world, not only Giza, there is what we would call an ancient world energy grid. Stonehenge, Nazca, Machu Picchu, various sites that are on geodetic points seems to have an upwelling of certain, what we call today, subtle energies. So Giza might have been one of these locations that was resonating this subtle energy that we call today for some other purpose. Point being, what I'm going to show you in this new research is there seems to be something that says the crossover between Akhenaten and Moses has some validation, and that the story of the Ark goes well beyond the Jewish tradition of just the Exodus. Okay, so most of you are familiar with the traditional story of Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Ark. But what we also have here is a symbolic reference to how the Ark is carried and how it's always dressed. It's always known to be something of great power. While this was a symbolic reference of the Ark's power, I think they did a pretty good job of saying why you don't want to mess with the Ark of the Covenant under the wrong circumstances. And even in modern media, the way we convey the power of the Ark is something that it has great energy. It's a very large energy source. Could it also be a communication device with God of some sort, or some higher dimension, or higher being? But as you can see, that even in the movie, while this guy is about to be toast, you can see that symbolically they did a very good job of accurately displaying what I've also found out to be validated by looking at various different biblical sources and how they convey the interaction with the Ark on a serious note. So you can see here that the actor has a staff, he's wearing a robe, and most importantly, he's wearing a chest plate with 12 emeralds. Now, this is a theme that seems to be carried through as a certain type of dress, radiation shielding of some sort, something that's always worn and spoken of, that if you approach the Ark in the wrong way, if you touch it in the wrong way, you die. Now, what's interesting is that, pre-Exodus stories in the Jewish tradition, what we find throughout Egypt are references of the Ark all over Egypt. And more specifically, a lot of the things that we find in the Ten Commandments found in precursor texts all over Egypt. The Dead Sea, not the Dead Sea Scrolls, but the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and many other places where it's inscribed essentially the same Ten Commandments, but in an Egyptian dialect well before the Exodus from Egypt. So it seems that there are precursor events following the Jewish tradition and an understanding of the power and usage for the Ark of the Covenant in Egypt. All over Egypt, there again are these references of this great type of box where there was a connection that the Pharaoh had access to it or used it. In the movie Stargate, they got in this large box and was able to regenerate or somehow become healed instantly. But it's very interesting that we have these reliefs over and over, not only in Egypt, but in other cultures, that show the Ark being carried always with a certain type of headdress, certain type of chest plate and wardrobe. So here even I found a stock image, I believe, on some site that was, again, just for artwork purposes, but very accurately showing someplace in Egypt where, again, they have the idea of the same conveyance of the Ark being in use. Now, the conveyance of the Ark takes on different forms too. Like, I'm not sure if it's exactly just a communication device or an energy source, but it's also sometimes a conveyance being shown as something that they're either traveling with or assisting their travel where they go to. I don't exactly know. But what's interesting about that is that a lot of these times it seems to be a preparation for the afterlife. That somehow they're tapping into another gateway or access where the pharaoh is prepared in the mummy state and some of these things that they think is the afterlife. Maybe this is an actual, again, cargo cult or ancient astronaut representation of something they saw, misunderstood, and are now replicating as a traditional practice, ritual practice. So when we look at the evidence for the sarcophagus in the king's chamber, what we see first of all is nothing resembling a king's chamber. If it was a king's chamber prepared for burial, we would see his eminence inscribed all over the walls to his praise. We see nothing like that. All we see is blocks, crystalline blocks, crystal and quartz fit so perfectly that you can't even fit a credit card in between the cracks. It's almost as if they were using this room to pass large amounts of energy through it. The dimensions of the sarcophagus seem to fit the exact cubit dimensions biblically for the Ark of the Covenant, so much so that you could literally just fit the Ark. It would kind of just lower itself right in there. Now, this raises a lot of questions about the uses of the Ark of the Covenant. If it's being conveyed and showed properly, it was a large energy source. And being able to power the Great Pyramid was a purpose that we seem to know existed. Christopher Dunn wrote a great book called Giza, the Power Plant. I believe it was the power plant, something like that. The Giza, the Great Power Plant, something like that. Christopher Dunn's a great engineer and has looked at many different aspects for the engineering purposes of the tunnelways and the way they've sculpted the rooms. A lot of the machining and things that were needed to create these, not only blocks, but the actual math that aligns these things is so perfect and precise, it boggles modern day engineers. So a lot of evidence points to the fact that Giza was not just a place that was a burial for the pharaohs, but that the pyramids, the Great Pyramid specifically, was harnessing some type of energy. There's actually waterways too that come up from the Nile into passageways and cause a pulse just on basic tidal changes from low tide to high tide and seasonal changes that create a pulsing effect of the water, where this also creates a static charge buildup, that they could somehow be tapping into energy or doing things with the pyramid that we still don't fully understand. But it's pretty clear that the pyramid in itself was a great artifact, but the Ark is still something of a great mystery, and we don't know the true location of the Ark. It could be in Ethiopia, it could be like in Raiders of the Lost Ark, stored away in some underground warehouse under the Vatican or something. But the point of it is to look at history's documentation visually and also understand in context what it was being used for. So what I did again was just take a sliver of information looking at only the biblical versions showing information about the Ark, which we'll see in a minute here, but also kind of diving further into Egypt and finding references of information that discuss or talk about the lineage of the Ark through different dynasties. And there are some researchers in Egypt looking around the background of Akhenaten and the split off between the information between the track of Moses and the track of Akhenaten and looking at the differences. I was recently interviewing someone named Dr. Zaki Hawass, who is the director of the Antiquities, the director for the Giza Plateau having to do with antiquities for like 20 years. He's now retired from that. But in the last 20 years, if you saw a CBS or ABC or NBC special on Egypt about some tomb or a mummy, hands down, it was Dr. Zaki Hawass doing the interview. Now, Dr. Zaki Hawass just recently uncovered the tomb of Akhenaten's wife, which is a very interesting connection in that we now know that King Tut, Tutankhamun, that famous pharaoh, a young pharaoh, well, Akhenaten was his father, right? So now they found King Tut's mother as well. But not a lot of light is shed on the story of Akhenaten. And again, folks, it's a very interesting line of information. I'm probably going to touch on some of it in my lecture, but it spawns into a new realm of how I look at our past, which is that there's a lost cycle of time. The further we look back into the epochs of time, we see that the ancients tracked the cycles of time like using the heavens as a large celestial clock. They broke down the heavens into 12 constellations, and we move through those constellations using, again, the heavens as a marker. We move through those ages, each 12 of those, we move through each one every 2,000 years. So if you figure there's 12 of them, and each cycle, each age lasts 2,000 years, there's a 24,000-year cycle, which we now call the precession of the equinox. All the ancients somehow tracked this knowledge, and it shows that they were aware that we seem to go through cycles of change that are cyclical here on Earth. That seems to be logical, right? Just like the seasons are cyclical. So there seems to be a cycle of time where we go into the dark ages, forget everything, and then we go to these great feats called the Golden Age, and we have heightened knowledge, heightened awareness, probably heightened interaction with higher beings, and then we dip back into the dark ages and forget everything. We've just now come back out of those dark ages, going back up towards another Golden Age. Golden Age probably won't be for another 8,000 years, looking at how you look at this 24,000-year cycle of time. I'm going to touch on some of that in my lecture, but the whole reason why I'm bringing it up, folks, is that Akhenaten is from that lost Golden Age. He is so far back in the past from one of the first dynastic views of Egypt that his reign was holding on to that last time that we were in the Golden Age, probably 10 to 13,000 years ago, probably around the true time of when the pyramids were built. So a lot of things come into alignment with the understanding that there's a larger cycle of time, and that some of these key players that we still have access to are holding on or held on to this higher knowledge that, once again, we're just now starting to re-piece back together. Okay, so the Ark, again, as far as its physical descriptions and a lot of the biblical texts that we have, seem to be very much in alignment with it being a large energy source. It's always emanating a large amount of power. So over and over, what we see are the conveyance of different cultures: Greek, Roman, Ethiopian, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Hindu, various cultures, all having references to the power of the Ark of the Covenant and some of the acts that took place with its presence. Now, again, some of the traditional views in the Exodus and the Jewish tradition in the Old and New Testament around the Ark of the Covenant were that it was more of a communication source with God, and that you were able to be in God's presence, what have you, using the Ark of the Covenant. But again, note the priests and how their wardrobe looks very similar and congruent. It's always the same type of outfit that they wear as they go through the different views of the interaction with the Ark. So different cultures all had this shared knowledge of the vast power of the Ark. And again, it seems to have a much deeper origin than just coming out of the Exodus story of Egypt, that it was being somehow harnessed to a great capacity by some of these older cultures. Now, sometimes too, it's also, as I mentioned, used as some kind of conveyance, as a gateway. They're either traveling with it or they use it to open a gateway of some sort. And again, notice the plate on his chest always being in prominence, that they had some type of radiation shielding or protection. And I actually did some tests with the History Channel, which I'll probably have some pictures of that, where we analyzed some of this information, so that we did a test on camera with a physicist here at the University of California, Irvine, and built a replica of the Ark. And noticed that the way it's constructed is that you have to touch it at certain points to stay grounded. And if not, it's just like touching a live wire, like a telephone pole or something, that has an exposed wire. You don't want to do that. So there's physical instructions and descriptions around the dress and mannerisms needed to approach the Ark. So again, I found this very interesting, that it was across cultures: Saudi Arabian, Israel, Roman, Egyptian, many different cultures had the same respect and understandings for how you stood and approached the ark. Now, the true purpose of what they were doing with the ark, again, is something that we're going to have to vet out further, but there are some clear connections to it being used in Egypt as a large energy source. And as someone, commented earlier about, electricity is old tech, I would agree with you, because the super old tech seems to be even more amazing, is that they were using a way to harness energy globally in this, world energy grid. And there might have been artifacts like the Ark of the Covenant at key locations that were somehow allowing them to harness or transmit this energy in ways that we just don't understand fully. But again, the conveyance of how it's carried was always shown with the two poles, and always very protective. And again, with certain people that weren't in the highest positions transporting the ark, as you see here, we're given very specific instructions that if you touch it in a certain way, you will die. And of course, some people, don't listen. So again and again, we start to see references of the ark not only being used as a gateway, but also starting to be used as a great weapon. Something that showed, again, that it had a great amount of power and that could stand before any army and allow them to just wipe them out. Okay. A lot of these scenes, again, start to raise the question about, why would Akhenaten, for example, if he was leaving and take the ark with him, it wouldn't have been just a big battery, obviously, right? It would have had multi-purposes. And this is another side note, but it was brought to my attention by one of my colleagues, Walter Cruttenden, a fellow researcher, that a lot of the other visuals that we see for the gods, especially the Sumerians, Mayans, Aztecs, a lot of them seem to be carrying what looks like a purse. And sometimes they're also holding what's known as the cone, a little tree of life reference. But a lot of them have this conveyance of a purse. And what seems to be interesting about this is there's a connection with this that has to do with something that, let's call it modern references of Mary Poppins and her purse, right? She could pull all kinds of magic stuff out of her purse. Felix the cat, right? The cartoon, in his little purse that he could like open a bag and just have tricks, So there seems to be a conveyance of gods having the ability to, at an atomic level or at the ability to manipulate matter, a conveyance for that, an actual visual to say, I'm at a status where I have the ability to manipulate matter or play at that level. And there are Hindu references to some of this information as well that kind of explain this further. And then we see these playing out in other cultures where I can make connections like Mayan and Aztec, and of course this Sumer. So a lot of these pieces, like the ark, it's interesting to see that they have a large conveyance of energy, but just like Mary Poppins in her magic bag, she was able to pull out multiple things. The ark could have multiple purposes that they were able to access or do things depending on how they harnessed its energy.